Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Usher, and I work with Dr. Linda Prokopi at the Natural Resources Social Science Lab in Purdue University. And today I'm going to give you an overview of our role in the St. Mary's Watershed project, as well as give you some updates about the surveys and interviews that we conducted over the past couple of years. So if you were at the 2018 annual meeting, I'll be sharing a shortened version of the results that we shared then. So our two major tasks in the St. Mary's Watershed project is to conduct surveys and interviews in the first year of the project, which is 2018, as well as the last year of the project, which is 2021. Both 2018 and 2021 interviews will focus on attitudes and behaviors regarding management practices, on-farm decision-making, conservation partnerships, as well as sources of advice and relationships in the St. Mary's Watershed. In 2018, the data that we gather provides a baseline information for where the St. Mary is at in terms of attitudes and behaviors regarding these topics. And this information will also inform outreach and education initiatives put on through the project. In 2021, we'll conduct similar surveys and similar interviews, while that information will measure the impacts of the outreach and education efforts done by the project, as well as the project itself, and give participants an opportunity to provide feedback and insight onto the project. So first, our interviews were conducted between October 2017 and July 2018. We interviewed 21 people, and those folks were part of NRCS, Soil and Water, as well as ISDA. We interviewed a couple extension agents, as well as some St. Mary's farmers and certified crop advisors who work with producers in the St. Mary's watershed. The interviews focused on water quality and sort of the interviewee's perception of water quality in the St. Mary's, conservation partnerships, collaboration in the St. Mary's, as well as influential groups in the watershed. The survey, we conducted one in March of 2018 and then again in January of 2019. And that survey went out to farmers and landowners in the St. Mary's watershed and received a combined response rate of 48.7%, which is great, and we appreciate your participation in that. And the survey addressed topics around water resources and what could possibly be impairing the St. Mary's watershed, sources of advice and relationship in the St. Mary's watershed, management practices and decision-making on the respondent's farm, as well as information about the respondent's farming operation. So we're going to go over sort of our preliminary interview results from our 2018 interviews first. One of the major things that we heard from these interviews is there needs to be a focus on local people. So there needs to be coordination between all of the agencies involved, which would be the NRCS, the Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as ISDA, and private sector partners such as commodity groups. So from the information that we gathered from these interviews, we recommend increasing representation at the local level from the various state-level organizations and agencies. So that is focusing on agency to producer sort of relationships. In terms of agency to agency or organization to organization, there's a lot of discussion about a need to coordinate these partnerships. A lot of discussion about how existing communication between these agencies and organizations is fragmented and sort of oriented around individual projects. So we recommend increasing regular communication between the local, state, and federal partners, all working within the same area to make sure everybody's on the same page and are able to contribute resources as needed in the St. Mary's. The third major takeaway that we have is the need to broaden networks. So there's a lot of discussion about how CCAs or certified crop advisors are trusted in the St. Mary's and used by many of the farmers, although they do not interface very much with NRCS or the soil and water folks. So we recommend broadening the conservation network to include CCAs and other private sector partners in conservation efforts. And finally, there's a lot of discussion about how messaging was different and at times conflicting from various sources. So we recommend developing a clear and cohesive message strategy that all watershed partners can agree upon and promote to the people that they work with. And now on to survey results. To measure the awareness of water impairments of respondents in the watershed, we asked them how much of a problem are the following water impairments. And we included sediment, nitrate, phosphorus, bacteria, and pesticides. And what we found was that respondents largely lack awareness of impairments in the watershed. In terms of sources of advice, we asked respondents, whose advice do you seek the most from the list below? We included crop advisors, so that includes both retail and independent crop advisors, other farmers and landowners, conservation entities or government agencies, so that would be the NRCS or Soil and Water or ISDA. We also included Purdue Extension, Farm Bureau, and other. So from the results here, we find that respondents identified CCAs as the most trusted source of information. To gauge practice familiarity with respondents, we asked everyone who took the survey, how familiar are you with the following practices? And we included cover crops, gypsum application, conservation tillage, as well as nutrient management plans. So, in terms of familiarity, we found that respondents adopted conservation tillage at the highest rate, which is above 50%, and nutrient management plan had the lowest rate of adoption. And related, which makes sense, respondents also indicated that they were most unfamiliar with nutrient management plans. So we can see that nutrient management plans has the lowest level of people who are currently using it, as well as the highest level of people who have never heard of it. So the next question is willingness to adopt. So for those who indicated that they are aware of the different practices but have not adopted those practices, we're then asked the question, are you willing to try these practices? So again, the same practices. We asked about cover crops, gypsum application, conservation tillage, and nutrient management plans. And the good news is we found that the majority of respondents who did not adopt, who have not already adopted the practices, would be or may be willing to adopt these practices. So that's great news for us. And in the subsequent surveys in 2021, we'll then be able to sort of compare and contrast and be able to see if there's been any difference in adoption and or willingness to adopt. So finally, we asked participants about the motivations and barriers that they have towards adopting these different practices. And the three major motivators for adopting these conservation practices that we found in the St. Mary's watershed was economics, on-farm benefits, and conservation ethic. So in terms of economics, there's a lot of motivation to adopt these practices if it increased their yields and if it reduced the input costs for their operation. The on-farm benefits that were cited as being a motivator were reducing soil erosion and improving soil health. And finally, the conservation ethic was also, respondents also indicated that a conservation ethic was a big motivator. And the conservation ethic is the idea that doing these practices is the right thing to do. In terms of barriers, time or management required to do these practices was a major barrier. And those practices that rated the highest for time or management were cover crops, nutrient management plans, as well as gypsum application. But equipment or technology required was also rated high for gypsum application and conservation tillage. So while timer management as well as equipment or technology were identified as the largest barriers to conservation practice adoption, these barriers did rate relatively low. So on a 5-point scale, these barriers were rated at about a 2. So regardless of how hard it is, these are still the barriers that people face in the St. Mary's. So on to 2021. As we mentioned before, we'll be conducting interviews and surveys again. Our interviews will only be focusing on St. Mary's farmers. We'll be asking similar questions to the questions that we asked in 2018, but we will then include a couple more questions about their participation in the outreach efforts that have been going on the past couple of years, and sort of the impacts that those events have had on them. And in 2021, we will also be sending a survey, again, to farmers and landowners in the St. Mary watershed. And we'll be asking similar questions, and as well as including a couple more questions about whether or not the respondents had participated, and sort of the impacts of those events. So that is our project update for the interviews and surveys that we've conducted over the past couple of years. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to contact me. My email is eusher@purdue.edu. And if you'd like to look at the full survey report, we have that on our website at the link below. So thank you very much and have a great day.